This is a segment we've been really enjoying as we close out the year, isn't it? I've been speaking with some prominent Australians about the year that's been 2020 and also try and inject a bit of hope into 2021. Tonight, my guest is an Australian politician who served as leader of the opposition, leader of the Australian Labor Party from 2013 to 2019. Now, had a fair bit to do with him on opposite sides of the political spectrum. I'm delighted he's on the show tonight. He's now, of course, the Shadow Minister for the NDIS and Government Services. Let's bring him in now for tonight's Year in Review. And that would, of course, be my guest, Mr. Bill Shorten. Bill, thank you for coming on the program. It's taken me a while to get you here, but I'm delighted you're here. First time I've spoken to you on camera since the election loss last year. What could Labor have done better? You've had some distance and some time to reflect, and I've been on the losing side of election battles as well. What could Labor have done better, do you think?
I think we needed to emphasise the jobs part of our policies, straightforward. And I also think that we had a lot of messages and a lot of policies, and I think perhaps that cluttered the space. But fundamentally, I asked myself, what could have I done better as opposed to Labor? And for me, I mean, I guess the old saying, and you can understand why the old saying survives, the best lessons are in defeat or loss. It's that whilst I've got a very keen sense of fair and unfair, sometimes that can make you arrogant to the point where you sort of think that because you think something's fair or unfair, you sort of assume that other people should agree with you. And other people have got their own perspectives on issues and can see the same set of facts but draw very different conclusions. So I guess that's a lesson for all who want to seek change or an improvement in the national interest. Just remember there is just other points of view. And perhaps in our eagerness to put our policies forward, that's something which, if the universe was to grant reruns, which of course it doesn't, I just think perhaps I'd temper some of my enthusiasm for what I think is fair and unfair with a bit of humility about other people having, equally solid positions from a different perspective.
You touch on something I often talk about here, and it's a sense that we've lost our ability to disagree, that we have opposite and different views, that they can be genuinely held, but that somehow if you don't agree with me, you're not just wrong, you're bad, that there's a moral turpitude component to it. If you were party leader again, would you be better second time around?
Well, I'm not, and I don't want to say anything which triggers any discussions about leadership, but what would I advise other people? It would be that we need to practice the politics of disagreement. That's fine. That's the Westminster system, but not the politics of destruction. So disagreement, okay. Destruction, not okay. And, across the political spectrum, with a very few exceptions on the far left and the far right, there's a lot that we can agree on. But somehow maybe, it's not just the politicians. I mean, media needs conflict, politicians need points of difference. But I do think that perhaps in that search for difference, we get to a point where we're in different corners and can't work together on the national interest. You've got to compromise a bit, to move forward. And everyone brings something to the table, and that's how do you harness everyone's point of view rather than just shoving your own down someone else's throat.
How does Labor win back the conservative working class? And of course, I get not alienate the Green progressives, but the people that used to be the Labor mainstay, and I was talking to Troy Bramston a moment ago, that feel sort of lost. They don't feel that the modern Labor not just doesn't want their vote, but doesn't respect their values, or particularly on social issues, rejects out of hand that they might have a conservative social view.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily want to exaggerate the extent that Labor's got to win back. We've got 48.5% of the two-party preferred vote. Now, obviously, that was disappointing. It wasn't a win, but we hold 68 seats in Parliament.
Sorry to interrupt. I just mean more broadly. I mean, if you look at where the primary vote's been in the 30s for some time.
I appreciate that, but part of the reason why our primary vote's been in the 30s is the rise of the Greens. Before the Greens, it was possible for, to have 43 and 44% of the primary vote, although we do better at the state level. I think the key issue is how do we balance the inner city sort of debate and also that blue collar and regional vote. And I think what links people is jobs. I think what links these people is family. I think what links these people is love of the nation. So I think it's about emphasising those things. You know, national security is important. Families are important. We've got to make sure that small business feels represented. And fundamentally, what draws all of this together is jobs. You know, we want an education system which prepares our young people for jobs of the future. We want to have good paying jobs now, and we want to make sure that if people can't find work, that they're unemployed for short periods of time, and we want to make sure that once people have finished working, that they've got a decent retirement. So I think jobs is the linking element which helps, you know, bridge some of that divide. And that's a challenge not just for us. I think it's a challenge for the Liberal Party. It's a challenge for mainstream politics. How do we... Australia's a big country and we've got very different views in different parts of Australia. So how do we unite the country rather than keep driving everyone to their corners?
I watched you closely when the towers were locked down in Melbourne, and I saw how you were out there treading a fine line as, you know, you needed to with the Premier locking down the towers, but you being concerned for the people locked up. And, you know, in scenes that were like when the doors were literally nailed shut in Wuhan, I thought it was extraordinary. And I thought to myself, you know, if a Liberal politician, if a Tony Abbott had locked 3,500 people in the towers for 2 weeks, you know, there would have been an injunction on a Human Rights Act and a High Court move and all of this sort of stuff. But Daniel Andrews got away with it. How do you rate the management of Victoria in the pandemic?
Well, masterfully, you've covered a range of topics, and from the start, you've got to the question at the end. Listen, I think on balance, Dan's done a good job. But we'll talk about the public housing towers. That was done, you know, just as the contagion was really taking off and spreading and the numbers were climbing. That was difficult. It wasn't Wuhan, China and people nailing doors shut, but it was a very tough number of days. And there were plenty of people who weren't happy with Labor. But I went down there, I did the best I could. A lot of people there are migrants, they work in the low-paid jobs which make our economy work, but I made sure that they got the right food. I mean, if you're of the Muslim faith, you don't need a ham and cheese sandwich on white bread, do you? You want to have what you're used to eating. So I was able to make a contribution at Flemington and North Melbourne. More generally, I mean, I look around the world and I think it's impossible to argue that Australia's done very well compared to the rest of the world. But that doesn't mean that people haven't done it tough in Victoria. The small businesses are probably the people I'm most conscious of, you know, the ones who are exposed by the loss of tourism or the city, you know, the businesses in the city. That's been really hard.
Restaurants in the city in particular, yeah.
Yeah, restaurants and the retail, you know.
Give me a positive as we go now. Give me a positive for 2020. It's been a difficult year. What's something you're going to hope that we don't lose as we move on to 2021 and 2022?
Well, I think we rediscovered community during the lockdown. I mean, in Melbourne, we were locked down for months, but we got back to doing things which I think perhaps in our busy lives we lose track of. I was able to spend more time with my family than I have in 10 years. Now, whether or not they consider that a positive, you'd have to interrogate them separately. But, you know, walks in the local neighbourhood. I got a sense that the community pulled together in a lot of Melbourne in a way which, you know, made you fall back in love with your own suburb. And so I thought community really came to the fore. The most common sentence I heard in Melbourne, I mean, I heard a few different sentences, but I think the most common sentiment that I heard is, whatever one's problem, there are other people doing it tougher. And that really reminded me of, is it Adam Lindsay Gordon who said, or was it Henry Lawson who said, kindness in your own troubles, kindness in another's troubles and, you know, strengthen your own. And I love hearing people, it's such an Australian thing to say, and I've seen it in other situations, natural disasters or whatnot, where people say someone else is doing it tougher than me. So I really think community came through.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's very true. There was always someone worse off than any of us at any given time and all of that. All the best to you and Chloe for Christmas, Bill. Thank you for coming on the show.
Good on you, Peter.